So many thanks, Dr. Kuzakari, for your nice introduction and also actually for organizing this fantastic series and your invitation, actually. I'm very glad to see many familiar faces or their names actually on the screen. And I'm going now to share my PowerPoint. I will start. So as you can see, I am going to talk about the Kura-Araxes cultural tradition or phenomenon with the focus on the diaspora actually in Iran. So as Jeffrey Summers and Michel Rossman and last week Betty Lyonnais have already paved the way for me, I am not going into details regarding the Kura-Araxes tradition. Michel told most of the stuff that we do know about this tradition in Iran, making actually this job a little hard for me to add something to it, not to repeat the story. Hence, among the limited options that I had, I will discuss another perspective that was less touched actually in the previous talks in this series, which is actually the nature of this phenomenon itself. So here you can see the geographical context of my talk. In this circumscribed area with these dashed lines, you can see the core area of the Kura-Araxes tradition. And in this gray part, you can see the dissemination area or the area of the Kura-Araxes material culture. And today I'm going to talk about this red actually area, which actually is the highland parts of the Iranian plateau. So, if you actually know the Kura-Araxes cultural tradition or have heard previous talks, actually with great interest, you may wonder that what has the Kura-Araxes to do actually with the early urbanization in Iran, as the topic of this series is so. So responding to this question, I would say that the Kura-Araxes is actually a kind of counterexample of lowland scenarios that we have heard so far in this series or in other presentations, workshops, or seminars. Or as Adam Smith actually put it to word or suggested, it's a kind of actually society against the state. So it reminds us that societies do not necessarily or inevitably take a kind of linear evolutionary trajectory or process. So in the era of urbanization in the 3rd millennium BCE and later, most of the Kura-Araxes settlements are either small hamlets or villages. And even in their large settlements, like Shengabit, as you can see here in the bottom of the slide, in the core area in Armenia, or in a Kohne Shahar or Ravaz in diaspora in Iran, which you can see here, the plan here, we see no trajectories of the urbanization process. And that is maybe why that this topic is actually included in this series. So if I want to give a kind of short summary of what has been already said about the Kura-Araxes in this series, I can say that in previous talk, we have heard about the Kura-Araxes chronology, the societal organization, the distribution pattern of sites, the economic system of this society, and literally whatever we know so far of this tradition actually in Iran. Hence, I am not going to repeat all of them here again. And just a kind of short notice on the characteristic or the key characteristic of the Kura-Araxes. So they formed one of the largest diasporic communities in the Southwest Asia during the 3rd millennium BCE, and roughly they cover 1,000 years, including 500 years in the diaspora. And they are considered as a kind of highland society. Most of their settlements are located in the highland areas, and their subsistence economy is known as the agropastoralism. And this society is, as I said, there is no evidence of social hierarchy or centralization in power or resource management. And that's the key characteristic I can say of this tradition. So regarding the framework and also content of my talk today. So I will talk about generally the migration, the diaspora, and also resiliency. And to do so in the first part as knowledge that could lead to the kind of bias in our studies. To make it clear that when we are talking about the Kura-Araxes in Iran, what is the quality and also the quantity of findings and data or a scale of them? And then I will talk about chronology to see if we could generalize about the recent narratives of the Kura-Araxes chronology initially proposed by Armenia and also later used by Toronto Mission in their try to frame the whole story actually of the Kura-Araxes story chronologically. Then I look at the migration scenarios and we'll address this question that among other alternatives like interaction, pastoral mobility, trade, emulation, and so forth, why we believe that this tradition is intertwined with migration. Last but not least, I propose a kind of different scenario for this phenomena under the resilience framework. So I should mention that this is a kind of a project in progress, and I will be happy to hear any constructive comments or suggestions actually at the end. So let's start. So first, let's talk about what we know and we do not. In our current understanding, the Kura-Araxes phenomenon actually, in the scale of Iran, suffers different shortcomings and at different levels. So here you can see, for instance, that these hatch areas in this map show the actually surveyed areas in northwestern Iran. The red points corresponds to the excavations before 1979, and the blue points, as you can see here, correspond to the excavations which carried out since 2000 after a long gap in this area. So as you can notice on the map, the field work and surveys were not equally actually distributed to cover the whole area. For instance, regarding the survey, you can see that there are still many areas and parts that are unsurveyed. And also, as you can see, most of the excavated settlements clustered around the Urumia Lake. So this unequal distribution of data, I would say that should be taken into account, since it could be a kind of source of potential bias in interpretation of settlement patterns or material culture dispersal. On the other hand, there is no final publication of most of the excavated sites. So maybe Yannick Tapre and Godin Tapre are now exceptions, but many other, the remaining actually refers, excavated sites are either preliminary, published as a kind of preliminary articles, or they are just a kind of small scale excavations. Hence, we should take this actually fact into account that much of the data on the settlement pattern come from either surveys or limited sand soundings and excavations which actually reach the Kura-Araxes relevant levels in just a kind of very restricted areas, for instance, like in Haftavan Tepe. So all of these shortcomings can blur actually the evidence that we have at hand. So the second flaw in the body of our evidence is available carbon dating. So here you can see the state of the carbon dating, which is available from Iran, and also the Southern Caucasus. I don't know, see if you see this map, but I would say that in Iran, I assume generally we have a kind of like 30, 35 samples. Whereas in the Southern Caucasus, we have like 200 actually carbon dating. So I think it's so clear, more dating is still demanding from this area. So in this table, actually, literally, you can see the critical information that we know so far from the Kura-Araxes and from the their excavated sites. So as you can see here, only a handful of the Kura-Araxes sites are actually systematically excavated, which yield evidence of the Kura-Araxes material culture, like the spatial organizations of the settlements, the settlement patterns, the households, their subsistence economy, and also the diachronic transformation. So despite all the shortcomings that I have mentioned, this evidence shows that chronologically, as you can see here, we have the first evidence of this tradition in Iran in the Kura-Araxes II phase, and just in a kind of circumscribed area in the Araxes basin, in the Kultepe and Kohnepaska, we have the evidence of the first phase of this tradition. And all other areas, as you can see, occupied during the 3rd millennium BCE, around 3000 or 2900 BCE, corresponding to the Kura-Araxes II phase. It means that we do not have the genocide, any evidence of the genocide phase of this tradition in Iran. Another critical point that I should declare at the beginning of my talk is that despite the scarcity of data and also the carbon dating that I have mentioned, what is pretty actually visible here, you can see, is the transformation and changes that happened around 2800 and 2700 BCE, at least in Iran. So the Kura-Araxes III phase in Iran is designated by some changes in the socio-economic organization, for instance, changes in the architecture, pottery style, and even in some areas in the resource management and also subsistence economy, as well as the abandonment of some sites, for instance, like Kohnepaska Tepesi in the Araxes basin, or the establishment of the new settlements, such as, for instance, Kohne Tepesi, and many other sites in the southern part of the Urumia Lake Basin or other parts of the basin. And the other evidence is, for instance, from the Goethe Tepe, as you can see in the bottom of this table. So even in this phase in the western part of Iran, we see the critical transformation during about 2700 BCE. So all this evidence actually urges us to still stick to this tripartite chronology. And accordingly, I do not share with Armenian Kura-Araxes phasing, at least for Iran. And I firmly still believe that the tripartite phasing, the Kura-Araxes 1, 2, 3, is more accurate for Iran. So talking enough of shortcomings, let's talk about the migration. So some of you that are already familiar with this tradition may say that the migration is so self-evident that it requires actually no explanation. Others who see migration as a kind of anachronistic framework for interpretation, or as a kind of manufactural approach that overlooks the complexity and the diversity of other factors at play may say, okay, another old-fashioned archaeologist. So not wishing actually to be considered as a scholar who is trapped in a cultural, historical, or diffusionist actually paradigm. It would be actually safer for me to ignore the migration or people movement scenario. However, after being asked at least 3 times on different occasions that why I go for the migration scenario, it occurred to me that maybe it's the time that we should talk about it in a kind of more straightforward way. So in my understanding, actually, migration and mobility are essential constituents of human nature and behavior. And different evidence from the Kura-Araxes core area and also outside of it explicitly actually demonstrates that migration and mobility were fundamental actually components of the Kura-Araxes phenomena. Hence, the migration scenario is not just based on the essentialist understanding of culture in the pots or people sense, but based on the bunch of actually other evidence that I will mention in the following slides. So the first evidence is already here. You can see on this map, and it's about the number of the Kura-Araxes settlements. So far, at least 300 sites of Kura-Araxes cultural tradition is recorded from Iran. And I would say that it's not the total number of their settlements or sites, it's beyond this number. It's just the number that we have, have been recorded so far. The second evidence actually is about the gap between the late Chalcolithic and the Kura-Araxes phase. So not only there is a stratigraphical gap between the late Chalcolithic and the Kura-Araxes phase, beside the discrepancies in the material culture, but we also a kind of different settlement pattern. So as you can see here on the map, the red triangles corresponds to the late Chalcolithic sites, and these black points correspond to the Kura-Araxes settlements. So you can see that we see a kind of different settlement pattern. And most of the Kura-Araxes sites are established in the new areas. Either, they are just in some areas, for example, close to the to the late Chalcolithic settlements. And as you can see, many of the late Chalcolithic settlements, like here or in this part, were abandoned and have never been settled again during the Kura-Araxes period. The other evidence is the lack of the genocide phase. So the Kura-Araxes genocide, as you can see here, is generally considered to be around 3,500 BCE, associated with the Kura-Araxes 1 phase, per Sagona's chronology, and occurs, as you can see here, only in the core area. In the highland parts of the Iranian plateau, except Kultap, as I mentioned, in the Araxes basin, all the other settlements around the Urumia Lake and also in Western Iran dated back to the 3000 or 2900 BCE, which is contemporary with the Kura-Araxes II. In other words, we do not have, the Kura-Araxes I is absent actually, and we do not have this phase in Iran around the lake or in Western part, and we just do it in the core area. The other evidence is related to the Kura-Araxes package and the genuineness of this package. So despite the regionalization, the whole package that has been found in Iran is genuine without any sign of hybridity or remnants of local indigenous traditions, maybe except the southern part of the Urumia Lake Basin. So the black burnished pottery, as you can see here, or these circular houses or architecture, has no actually background in Iran before this period, and were introduced actually for the first time by the Kura-Araxes groups in this part. So you can see here that the appearance of the Kura-Araxes cultural tradition in Iran is not just limited to pottery, but includes architecture, for example, andirons, and morandas in some parts, we could say non-specialized subsistence economy. The existence of this package indicates that people actually move there and live there with their different identities and material culture. So here you may say that maybe it was just a kind of short temporal visit or a kind of mobility. Then I go to my next slide. So from most sites in highland parts of the Iranian plateau, as far as the Arak province in the central Iran, the depth of the deposit of the Kura-Araxes settlements is at least 4 to 6 meters with established domestic architecture. So this depth and this architecture demonstrate that we are not confronted actually with the short-term circulation of nomads or mobile pastoral groups, but actually a long period of inhabitation, adaptation, and also resilience. So now hopefully that we are all on the common ground regarding the Kura-Araxes migration. This question may be raised that why do I and also some other colleagues insist on using the term diaspora for the Kura-Araxes groups? So diaspora as a term in this context does transcend its classical victim tradition. Here, the diaspora describes those who identify themselves with their homeland, but live outside it. And there is a different kind of evidence to it, which I am going to talk about. So besides these feelings of attachment to the homeland or to the core area, another critical reason for using diaspora and not mere, for instance, expansion is the Kura-Araxes dispersal to more than one area. As you can see, into Iran or into the upper Euphrates and also the Levant area or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. As Cohen mentioned in his outstanding publication on the diaspora, I quote him, "Strong attachment to the past or a block to assimilation in the present and future must exist to permit a diasporic consciousness to emerge or be retained," unquote. And it is what we think was the case during the Kura-Araxes period. The evidence in hand of this tradition may refrain us from having any idea regarding the social identity or the cognitive world of the Kura-Araxes people. By studying the material position, however, we could penetrate the thought and the cognitive world actually a little bit. One of these material positions that could belong to the outside and interior sphere is pottery and wares as a kind of cognitive medium. There are many incidental byproducts of this cognitive medium. For instance, the identity and ethnicity is one of them. So here I define the ethnicity based on David and his colleagues' actually definition as a membership in a group defined by shared cultural heritage and collective representation. Talking about collective representation, let's us check the degree of homogeneity and heterogeneity in the pottery style as one of our evidence. So as you know, different variables actually could be studied. For instance, the technology, morphology, surface treatment, function, or the amount of different types or each of types. So if you want to check, you can see, for instance, in all or most of the Kura-Araxes settlements, we see these slab techniques for production of the potteries, or the neck jars and goblets are kind of common forms in different sites, in different areas. And most of them were found in the domestic context. And regarding the decoration, for instance, have been found in Armenia as well as in Iran, or we see this incised or relief decoration in many actually different sites in different areas of Kura-Araxes settlements. And regarding the amount of types, even in one settlements or sites, we have different amount of types. So generally, we can see a great degree of homogeneity all along the Kura-Araxes ecumene, despite the regionalization. In this regard, I can also say that Mark Isserlis and Raphael Greenberg, by their comprehensive comparative technological analysis of the Kura-Araxes pottery inventories, perfectly show that the producers and consumers of the Kura-Araxes pottery maintain their identity over a vast area from the Armenia to Levant. So the conservative nature of the Kura-Araxes tradition, peculiarity, durability, and insistence on the remaining continuance of some of their material culture, even 200 or 300 years later, and most far away from their homeland, actually should have a reason beyond the function or taste, and speak of something important to the society. So although we are not yet sure to consider the Kura-Araxes society as one ethnical group or different subgroups, shreds of evidence showcase that shaping collective memory and a solid identity was actually critical for them, based on the maintenance of the material culture. After here accepting that Kura-Araxes in Iran were migrants, we face many other questions. For instance, why did they migrate? What were the triggers? Who did migrate? What were the mechanisms and dynamics of their migration? Shall we envisage this migration as an event or as a kind of long-term process? So ironically, although since 1940, when the term Kura-Araxes actually was coined, we have talked about the Kura-Araxes migration, we rarely know about its nature, and many of its aspects actually are taken for granted or have been taken for granted, such as, as I said, migration dynamics, its scale, the material culture of diaspora, the Kura-Araxes identity and collective memory, the interaction between the core area and also diaspora, and so on and so forth. For instance, based on the current framework in migration studies, in this diagram, you see the key variables that should be addressed anytime that we talk about the migration. For instance, how as archaeologists, we detect the footprints of migration in our material culture. What were the motivations behind the migration, or the pace and tempo of the migration? Or if it was just a member of a specific king group that migrated, or just women and children, or men, or actually, how was the impact on the migration on the core area or on the diaspora. So as you know, we do not have answers actually for many of these questions. And we should accept this critique that in addressing the Kura-Araxes phenomenon, we rarely got beyond the movement of the people. And the underlying economic and social process at work, the role of the roads and paths, and the physicality of the surrounding spaces, or the affordances of the places in harsh areas or landscape, or the impact of the movement on those left behind in the core area, and the relationships and the other are or have been actually hardly addressed. These shortcomings in the Kura-Araxes studies are not just a matter of lack of interest actually among the scholars concerned with this phenomena. Instead, I would say that it is up to our concept of migration itself and our ecological or anthropological perspective on it. As many of you, you know already, the history of migration studies in archaeology or anthropological archaeology is full of ups and downs. Migration is conventionally tackled in many case studies within an old-fashioned traditional framework. But why? So let's forget the Kura-Araxes and go to the migration. Here you can see that, reviewing the migration studies, either in archaeology or anthropology or other relevant disciplines, demonstrate that migration always has been framed under either vulnerability or adaptation framework, as you can see in the first part and in the second part, as a kind of undeliberate decision-making based on the external shocks or perturbations. Hence, we were and are always looking for push and pull factors. I would say that this approach to migration may lead us to overlooking some other critical factors at play. As you can see in these two publications, one of is already published, the other is under publication. I have here, these two articles already discussed or argued that going beyond the vulnerability and acknowledging the resilience framework, as you can see in the third part, as an approach may actually be more promising in the context of migration studies, and specifically in our case regarding the Kura-Araxes migration. In this context, migration is not reduced to a sign of failure of the local adaptive capacity, or won't be considered as solely a kind of crisis, as you're familiar with different archaeological literature. Instead, it pinpoints the multidimensionality and the potential merits of migration. This framework reminds us that this is not the migration that sounds old-fashioned as a kind of interpretation, but maybe our perspective on migration is outdated and should be maybe discarded or reformulated. Reviewing the migration literature in archaeology, one can see that in most migration scenarios, many hypotheses and analyses have embraced a deterministic view, for instance, that the environments shape human institutions and ignites change, or as we can read from different sources, collapse. Accordingly, we see that a kind of causative relationship was defined between climate change and migration in many cases. This view was always at the core, actually, of the drivers for the Kura-Araxes migration, as you can see here in these two diagrams. And many scholars mentioned climate change, for instance, or population growth as the push factors, and the leading drivers of the out-migration. There are also other pull factor scenarios that I'm not going to talk about them here. So I would say that the resilience framework invites us in this context to go beyond these push and pull factors and addresses migration as a kind of intentional decision-making. So we are just short to the resilience. So as you may know, resilience is a kind of multifaceted concept, and there are different approaches to thinking about resilience. There is no resiliency formula for any society or societal social system. Here you can see my understanding of resilience or resiliency based on different literature and sources, and what I mean when I am talking about resilience. So in my understanding, a social ecological system is resilient if it is able to change, adapt, and transform in response to stresses, rather than to return to some sort of equilibrium. In this sense, resilience is not something instinctive to society. Rather, the societies, through the cognitive process, by acknowledging their environment and surroundings, the provisional shocks and disturbances, envision remedies and strategies that lead to their actually resilience. And the last point is that resilience in this framework is a kind of dynamic process, and humans are active actually agents. In this context, migration is not just a reaction to monocausal environmental drivers or exceptional events or crises, but is considered as, for instance, Dr. Polrak and his colleagues put it aptly into the words, quote, as a pull on a continuum of proactive and reactive patterns of mobility, which result from the interplay between structural forces and human agency, unquote. So following Dr. Polrak and Stefan Burmeister and other colleagues, considering migration as an element of cultural behavior and as an integral part of livelihoods of many people and households around the world, may set a new theoretical foundation actually for addressing migration in archaeology. Another point that should be taken into account is talking about the scale of the migration. So, but migration scenarios, it does not always necessarily mean that the whole community out-migrate, but it could be on the scale of individuals or small groups and not the entire community, which I do believe that was the case regarding the Kura-Araxes actually cultural tradition. So under this framework, having a kind of bird's eye view of the Kura-Araxes phenomenon and the migration, I reframe the migration scenario inside the adaptive cycle, which you can see here, and is proposed as one of the toolkits under the resilience framework in resilience, studies. So just kind of short notice on this model. So this model or this cycle is a kind of model of natural patterns of change inside the ecosystems and eco-social systems. It was developed by Gunderson and Holling in 1973 and evolved later in 2000 to 2003. And as you can see, it consists of 4 distinct phases. We start from here, as you can see, from the back loop of this cycle. In the alpha phase, as you can see here, which designate the reorganization phase. And during this phase, the opportunities for a change are the highest. Then we go to this R phase, or growth and exploitation, And in this phase, we see the increase in the interaction and resource flows. Then we come to this K phase, or the conservation phase, where the system becomes over-connected and requires finding new pathways. Otherwise, it goes to this omega phase, or release, or as we know, crisis phase, where the system is less resilient. So many scholars also, I should notice that, have criticized this model. For instance, the latest one is Carola Heiss and her colleagues, for bearing the danger of leading a kind of top-down application of deductive models, or in the other word, fitting the archaeological data within a previous assumed model. So being aware of these pitfalls here, however, I use this model as a kind of metaphor to frame the transformations and thresholds that we see in the history of the Kura-Araxes in their core area and the diaspora, to do a kind of decipher these thresholds, actually. So in this framework, I argue that the Kura-Araxes expansion was not an event resonating with a momentary flux, but rather a phenomenon encompassing heterogeneous dynamics within different political, cultural, and geographical landscape. To scratch the surface, actually, in reframing the Kura-Araxes migration and get rid of these push and pull factors, I hypothesize that due to some unknown disturbances at the end of the 4th millennium BCE, parts of the society remained within the same system in the core area, as we can see the continuation of inhabitation in the homeland, in the core area, and parts of the Kura-Araxes groups reordered and reorganized and decided to migrate to other neighboring areas. So I start the Kura-Araxes from its back loop phase here, somewhere in the omega and in the alpha phase in the homeland, and then I will go to this R and K phase in the diaspora. I hypothesize that in this time span, as you can see here, during the KA1 phase, the cycle proceeds into the release and reorganization phase. In the reorganization phase, part of the population, as I said, and groups remain within the same system in the homeland, and the other part shifted their settlement dynamics and places and moved to the other areas. They restored resilience through internal adjustment by moving to other areas, and we see a kind of quick recovery and retainment. Hence, the Kura-Araxes migration was not a kind of chaotic change, but rather a kind of transformation governed by particular dynamics, conditions, and opportunities. Later, at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, during the Kura-Araxes II phase, they proceeded to the R phase, as you can see here, and expanded along a vast area and lived there until the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The migration to new lands and establishing new houses during the Kura-Araxes II prompt again some new shocks or challenges. But 400 years in diaspora, for instance, in Iran, demonstrate that they successfully rearranged their internal structure or adapted themselves to new conditions which designate their resilience. So at the end of phase 2, around 2700, 2600, which I consider as the Kura-Araxes III phase, Some Kura-Araxes II sites or settlements were abandoned, and some new sites were established. During this phase, the Kura-Araxes went to a kind of conservative phase of decay, as you can see here, which later around 2400 roughly BCE culminated in another Omega phase. So this ability of the Kura-Araxes system to persist while absorbing change is what makes it resilient. That's my argument, and shows its coping capacity. And I should say that resilience here is about functioning and not, for instance, sustainability or maintaining a kind of steady state or equilibrium. So even though parts of the Kura-Araxes population moved to other areas, it seems that there was no significant population decline for a long time, but rather, as I said, a kind of quick recovery and retention. Although I should mention that we still requires more data and evidence. But for instance, evidence of this deliberate and this successful decision-making process includes the continuity and reoccupation in the core area after a short gap, and the depth and the length of the occupation deposits in the diaspora. For instance, take just one case among the others. I should mention that, for instance, in this reference that you can see here in blue, which is under publication, I have discussed explicitly different evidence and different data about actually this hypothesis. And here I just, because lack of time, I just mentioned one case study, and it is Mitchell Rothman's scenario about the establishment and flourishing of Shengabit during or after the Grand Migration. In this site, as you can see here in the core area, in 2900 BCE, this occupation flourished and expanded into 6 hectares after the migration phase, actually during the Kura-Araxes II phase. And evidence 500 years of economic activity alongside ritual and ideological organization, as Mitchell Rothman and Simonian mentioned in their articles. So this site is actually an excellent demonstration of that the outmigration of the Kura-Araxes at the end of the Kura-Araxes I actually phase, which we can see and recognize from the short gap between the Kura-Araxes I and Kura-Araxes II sites or settlements in Armenia, did not culminate in collapse or substantial cultural transformation in the system, but as I said, in a kind of quick reorganization. According to this viewpoint, that the Kura-Araxes, I mean, based on this new hypothesis or this new viewpoint, the Kura-Araxes periodization is not only based on the pottery style or pottery typology, which is actually now the case, but also is more based on the transformation in the Kura-Araxes socio-economic organization. Based on this transformation, I argue that we should not hence encapsulate these roughly 500 years, 400 years into just one Kura-Araxes II phase, and we should instead divide it into another different phase of the Kura-Araxes III, at least for Iran or for the diaspora areas. So although more evidence is still required and demanding, this tripartite division actually seems more accurate and more solid based this proposition for the diaspora. So at the end of this phase, I mean, after the Kura-Araxes III phase, the whole Kura-Araxes system returns to a kind of backloop phase within the distribution of a new tradition, the early Kurgan or March copy Bedouin tradition, along a vast area in the core area, and also the abandonment of all other sites or settlements in the diaspora around 2500 roughly BCE. So to sum up, the Kura-Araxes studies in Iran still suffer the lack of data, reliable carbon dating, and systematic excavations. In this sense, the Kura-Araxes cultural tradition, despite these shortcomings, I would say that this tradition is one of the rare cases among the pre-institutional entities in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE that allows us to explore continuity, adaptation, and resiliency. The Kura-Araxes migration under this framework was neither a one-time event nor a simple movement from point A to point B, but rather occurred as a cycles of movements back and forth across a vast area beyond the core area, but also including inside the core area. So as the last slide of this talk and presentation, I should say that for archaeologists, finding the resilience strategies of prehistoric societies through excavation is just frustrating work. It is not at all easy to identify the anticipatory behavior or responses of a society to risk and vulnerabilities, or even to recognize those perturbations and socioeconomic shocks or hazards in the short and long term. That said, it is a great challenge to take up. When we pay attention to the strategies that past societies used to maintain resilient relationships and the methods and remedies they found to deal with threats, stresses, and disturbances to their way of life, we may uncover insights and even solutions for the problems that challenge our modern world. And this is actually tempting enough for us as archaeologists to take up this challenge. So many thanks for your attention. Okay, I'm going to translate my talk into Farsi. با سلام مجدد به دوستان و همکاران گرامی. به عنوان در واقع خلاصه فارسی سخنرانی باید بگم که در این سخنرانی در واقع من درباره فرهنگ کورا-ارس و تحت در واقع چارچوب نظریه تاب‌آوری در واقع بحث کردم و به عنوان حالا ویژگی‌های عمومی این فرهنگ ذکر کردم که در واقع این فرهنگ یکی از بزرگترین نمونه‌های جوامع دور از وطن در هزاره سوم پیش از میلاد در باستانشناسی جنوب غرب آسیا هستش و معرفی یک جامعه با اقتصاد کشاورزی و کوشگری و ساکن در ارتفاعات هستش در واقع و نمونه بسیار خوبی هست که به ما نشون میده که جوامع لزوما یک مسیر تک خطی تکاملی رو طی نمی‌کنن و در عصر شهرنشینی کورا-ارس به ما به خوبی نشون میده که الگوهایی متفاوت از اونچه که ما در نواحی پست مثل بین‌النهرین میبینیم هم وجود داره و حتی بزرگترین استقرارهای این فرهنگ مثل شنگابید یا کهنه‌شهر هیچ نشانه‌ای رو از جوامع طبقاتی یا مدیریت تمرکزگرا بر منابع قدرت رو نشون نمیده. بعد به مشکلات این فرهنگ پرداختن به عدم پراکنش روشمند کارهای میدانی، کمبود کاوش‌های روشمند و سوال محور و اندک بودن در واقع تاریخ‌گذاری‌های کربن 14. بعد از اون به ویژگی‌های این فرهنگ اشاره کردم و اینکه بر همین اساس در واقع گاهنگاری سه فازی برای این فرهنگ در واقع فاز اول و دوم و سوم خیلی دقیق‌تر هست تا گاهنگاری که دو فاز رو برای این فرهنگ در نظر میگیره و این بر اساس شواهد مختلفی هست و به دلیل تغییراتی که ما در شمایل فضایی استقرارها یا نظام اجتماعی و حتی نوع مدیریت منابع و اقتصاد معیشتی این جوامع می‌بینیم. مسئله بعدی به مسئله چرایی مهاجرت پرداختم، اینکه چرا ما قائل به فرضیه مهاجرت هستیم و بر اساس شواهد مختلفی از جمله تعداد استقرارها، انقطاع فرهنگی بین دوره مسنگی و دوره کورا-ارس، عدم وجود شکلگیری این فاز این فرهنگ در ایران و نهشته‌های بسیار ضخیم این فرهنگ رو از دلایلی برشمردم که نشون میده این فرهنگ در یک بازه طولانی در واقع یک فرهنگ مهاجر در ساکن در بخش‌های از فلات ایران بوده و حدود 400 سال در واقع در این سرزمین زندگی میکنه. نکته بعدی استفاده از واژه دیاسپورا هستش که من بهش اشاره کردم، یا اصطلاح جوامع دور از وطن، و گفتم که این کاربرد این واژه دیگه در واقع برای اون بافت خاص تاریخی و قربانی گونه‌اش هست که تا به حال در واقع بیشتر از اینها استفاده میشد و اشاره به جوامع و یا گروه‌هایی داره که خارج از سرزمین مادری خودشون هستن اما به اون حس تعلق دارن و این تعلق و وابستگیشون رو به انواع مختلفی در مواد فرهنگی خودشون نشون میدن و ما به خوبی در میان کورا-ارسی ها میبینیم که اونها به نوع یک تلاش آمدانه‌ای دارن برای نشان دادن نمادهای فرهنگی سرزمین مادرینشون و همسانی مواد فرهنگی در یک گستره بسیار بزرگ از ایران گرفته تا سواحل شرق مدیترانه به خوبی این همسانی رو نشون میده. مشکل بعدی مسئله باستانشناسی مهاجرت و چارچوب سنتی هست که چه در علوم انسانی و چه در علوم اجتماعی در اقصا نقاط دنیا ما باهاش مواجه هستیم و من بحث کردم که این چارچوب سنتی باعث شده که کمی مثلا مهاجرت کورا-ارسی‌ها با شک و شبهه بهش پرداخته بشه و به نظر میرسه که الان زمان اون هست که ما به یک پارادایم جدید برسیم برای مسئله مهاجرت و اون رو برای در واقع چهارچوب آسیب پذیری یا تطبیق اجباری بهش بپردازیم و به نوعی مهاجرت رو بخشی از روند و ماهیت فرهنگی رفتار جوامع انسانی بدونیم که یک کنش رفتاری هست به جای اون که یک واکنشی از روی اجبار به یک علت بیرونی باشه و اینجا هست که تئوری تاب‌آوری در واقع به کمک ما میاد و این پارادایم جدید رو میتونه برای ما تعریف کنه. تعریف من از تاب‌آوری یعنی توانایی دوام جوامع و عدم تغییر بنیادیشون در مواجهه با چالش‌ها و مخاطرات درونی و بیرونیشون هستش و اینکه تاب‌آوری یک مسئله پویاست با عملیات انسانی و جوامع در واقع با شناخت منابعشون میتونن به استراتژی‌هایی برسن که باعث تاب‌آوریشون بشه و بر همین اساس من پدیده مهاجرت کورا-ارسی ها رو در داخل چرخه انطباق یا اداپتیو سایکل بازنگری کردم و پیشنهادات رو بر این اساس دادم و روایت جدیدی رو از مهاجرت اونها ارائه کردم. البته اینها همه در حد فرضیه هستش و من هنوز در حال کار بر روی این الگو هستم و در حال تکمیل کردن اون هستم و بر این اساس گاهنگاری که سفازی که ما برای کورا-ارس در واقع پیشنهاد میدیم دیگه تنها مبتنی بر فرهنگ سفالی نیستش بلکه ساختار و تحولات اجتماعی رو هم مد نظر قرار میده. به طور کلی به عنوان نکته آخر این که اگرچه نظریه تاب‌آوری درهای جدید رو در پژوهش‌های این دوره به روی ما باز میکنه اما مطالعه و بازنگری این فرهنگ در چارچوب این نظریه هم کار راحتی نیست و با چالش‌های بسیاری روبرو هست ولی وقتی به عنوان یک باستانشناس از کاوش یک محوطه و شناخت یک فرهنگ هدف ما این باشه که به رفتارهای جوامع گذشته، به استراتژی‌ها و روش‌های مدیریت و مقابله اونها و راه حل اونها برای مواجهه با بحران‌های اطرافشون بپردازیم و دانشی رو که در طی قرن‌ها از زندگی ساکنان فلات ایران به دست اومده به جامعه معاصر ایران این دانش رو یادآوری کنیم. این شناخت و آگاهی که این تجربه زیسته ساکنان این فلات ممکن است اون رو از گذشته به کمک به امروز ما پیوند بده و به کمک جامعه امروز ما بیاد، پذیرش این چالش سخت رو و یافتن راه حل هایی رو برای برون رفت از بحران های فعلی در واقع ایران کمی شاید برای ما باستانشناسان راحت تر بکنه. این خلاصه‌ای بود در واقع از سخنرانی امروز.